Welcome back. We're now going to talk about industry attractiveness. This is part of the topic around capturing value. There are two main determinants of value capture: the strategy that a particular firm has, but also the features of the industry in which that firm is competing in. It's well known that industries vary in their average profitability. Some industries are systematically more profitable than other industries. In this diagram, we note that pharmaceuticals is a very profitable industry. At the other extreme, airlines is not a very profitable industry. In this diagram, we see that the average profits of firms in the pharmaceutical industry is higher than the average profits of firms in the healthcare equipment industry and so on, as we compare to department stores and airlines. Within the industry, within each of these industries, within the pharmaceuticals industry, firms vary in their average profitability. But notice that industry factors, there are industry level factors which influence all of the firms in that industry. Based on this diagram, you would rather be a firm in the pharmaceuticals industry than be a firm in the airlines industry, for example. But industry factors aren't the only thing that matters. As we can see from this diagram, department stores are a less attractive industry on average than the pharmaceuticals industry. However, you might be better off being the most successful firm with the best strategy in the department store industry than the worst firm with the worst strategy in the pharmaceuticals industry. I would rather be firm I than firm D, because even though I'm in an unattractive industry, I'm the most successful firm in that industry, and my absolute level of profitability is higher than the worst firm in the airline industry. Of course, we can all agree that we'd all love to be firm A, the most successful firm with the best strategy in the best possible industry. And strategic thinking is in large part about figuring out how to become just like firm A. In strategy, we want to try and understand as best as we can why it is that some industries are systematically more profitable than other industries. What is it about the pharmaceutical industry that makes it, on average, more profitable than, say, the airline industry? And this is where a very famous framework in strategy comes in. The framework referred to as the 5 forces framework, or typically attributed to a very famous strategy professor called Michael Porter. Porter's 5 forces is how we usually refer to this. Here are the 5 forces listed in the middle of this slide: substitutes or complements, barriers to entry, supplier power, buyer power, and rivalry. These are the so-called 5 forces. And I want to spend a little bit of time explaining each of these, but it's important that we keep in mind that this is a framework you apply for evaluating the attractiveness of an industry. It's about industry attractiveness, not about the particular strategy of any particular firm. The unit of analysis is the industry. Another way of putting that is to say that the focus is on the long-term profitability of a typical incumbent in that industry. In order to explain these 5 forces, let's consider an example. An example I like is the bicycle industry, or in particular the high-end road cycling industry. These are the kinds of road bikes that people use in the Tour de France and those other big international cycling events. This industry has a value chain in the construction and manufacture of these high-end road bikes. At the very top, it begins with raw materials. Steel, carbon fiber, aluminum, and other raw materials are purchased by the companies that make individual components that go into road bikes. Those components include the drivetrain, which includes the gears, the brakes, and all of the mechanical pieces around the drivetrain of a high-end road bike. There are frame manufacturers, there are wheel manufacturers, saddle manufacturers, and many other manufacturers of different individual components. One of the really interesting things about this industry is that over time, it's evolved in such a way that the companies that make these components tend to be fairly specialized. In other words, there are not very many instances of companies that make both frames and wheels, for example. There's a set of companies that make just frames, a set of companies that make just wheels, and so on. These companies then provide those components to a layer of the value chain that we refer to as the bike designers, assemblers, and brands. This is where companies like Trek, Cannondale, Specialized, the well-known brands of the bikes, that's where they exist. And interestingly, most of these companies do very little in the way of actual manufacturing themselves. They design the bike, they purchase all of the components from these specialized component manufacturers, and then they assemble those bikes, and they do branding and marketing activities around that. These companies, of course, then, this is going to be, by the way, our focal industry in the example we're going to talk about right now. These companies like Trek and Cannondale then sell their bikes to retailers, and the retailer segment of the value chain is mostly independent, small, fragmented retailers around the world. There have been a few instances where major bike companies like Trek have experimented with having their own retail businesses, but that's a very small portion of this industry overall. Generally speaking, the retailers are independent, highly fragmented retailers spread all around the world. And then, of course, the retailers sell these bikes to the end user, the consumer. In this example, let's talk about the focal industry being the bike designers, assemblers, and brands. Because when we apply Porter's 5 forces, we have to do so on the basis of a very specific definition of the industry that we're going to look at. And the reason for choosing this example is we can talk about the buyers to this industry as being the retailers. So when we talk about buyer power, we talk about how powerful are the retailers in their negotiations with these bike designers, assemblers, and brands. When we talk about the suppliers to this industry, we'll talk about all of the individual component suppliers, the drivetrain suppliers, the frame suppliers, and so forth. They are going to be the suppliers to the industry. We'll also talk about rivalry within the industry. How much are these firms all competing with each other within the industry? How intense is the competition between Trek and Cannondale and Specialized and so forth? We can also talk about barriers to entry as one of the 5 forces, as new firms seek to come in and enter into this industry. How easy would it be for me to go and start up my own business that does bike design, assembling, and brands? What are the barriers to entry to breaking into this industry? And then lastly, the question about substitutes and complements is a question about other industries. What other industries out there that are not even part of this value chain, which would provide a sense of substitute or complement to this industry? For example, with high-end road cycling, you might wonder about mountain biking, or you might wonder about skiing, or other forms of exercise and recreation that would be a substitute for this particular industry. There are other industries that are also complements to this industry, such as the clothing manufacturers, the helmet manufacturers, who are not part of this value chain in creating an actual bike, but they provide products which are highly complementary to high-end road biking. But you can see how with this example, it begins with clarity around what exactly is the focal industry. And once you know what the focal industry is, you talk about the suppliers to that industry being the firms that provide inputs into the focal industry, the buyers to that industry being the firms that you sell to from that focal industry. In this case, that's going to be the retailers. We're not going to go through a full-blown 5 forces analysis here, but I think you intuitively can see that once you have clarity around what the industry is and the value chain that that industry exists within, you can begin to undertake the analysis of, is this industry, the bike designer industry, an attractive industry to be in? And if so, why? And if not, why not? Here is a more detailed, specific set of the kinds of questions you would ask in doing a detailed industry analysis, in applying the 5 forces framework to this industry. I realize there's a lot of information on this slide, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. So you might like to pause the video right now and look at all of these different 5 forces and focus in on the specific questions, which will help you to understand what does it mean to evaluate the attractiveness of an industry under each of these 5 forces. It's important as you do this analysis that you draw a conclusion at the end. You're going to be asking the question, overall, is this an attractive industry or not? And let me make 2 quick comments on that. First of all, it only takes one of these 5 forces to be unattractive in order for the industry to be unattractive. For example, there could be an industry where there are no other industries that are threatening to this industry. Supplier power may be low, buyer power may be low, and barriers to entry may be high, preventing new firms coming into the industry, but there could be a high degree of rivalry, leading firms to be highly competitive and not capture much value. Just having one force, in that case rivalry, be unattractive is enough to make the industry unattractive as a whole. We don't have to have all 5 forces be unattractive. That said, if there's only one factor that's unattractive, there's at least a good chance that a firm can develop a strategy which would help to address that unattractive feature. A strategy which specifically focuses on how could we mitigate the harmful effects of rivalry. If, however, there were many unattractive forces, if an industry had high supplier power, high buyer power, low barriers to entry, and a high degree of rivalry, it makes it nearly impossible for any one firm to develop a strategy that would address each of those unattractive features. So that's an important part of the value of this framework. You can see how this framework helps to clarify what challenge the strategy of the firm needs to address. To wrap up, different industries are more or less profitable than others. Industries vary in the average level of profitability. Some industries are fundamentally more profitable than other industries to be in. The 5 forces analysis helps you to understand why. What are the structural features of the industry that lead one industry to be more profitable than the other? And if you can get clarity around that, diagnosing why this industry is not attractive, that can help you to refine and develop a strategy which would at least allow you to become one of the most profitable firms given that level of attractiveness. Up next, I want to move to talking about strategy articulation. How exactly do we describe the strategy of a particular firm?